Mercedes lead the Constructors' Championship at the halfway point. Mercedes with the long car, about 10 centimetres longer than the Ferrari. And a friend of mine, Enrico Scalabroni, who has been on my YouTube channel a few times, used to be a Ferrari engineer, worked for various other teams as well, won Le Mans with Peugeot, knows what he's talking about, rang me when he saw the Mercedes and he said, for sure this car is going to have problems with corner turn-in because with the wider tyres, there's more turbulence at the back, the centre of pressure has moved, and the only way to compensate for the centre of pressure change is to go to a shorter wheelbase, not to go to a longer one. And the longer the wheelbase, the more out of sync the centre of pressure will be with the centre of gravity and all the other things that matter. And I think he's kind of been proved correct in everything he said. I'm looking forward to getting our animation team, Dean and Emma Wright, and Willem Towett, to show exactly what we mean by all that and the effect of the turbulence in the centre of pressure and how it will have been moved by the additional turbulence of the wider tyres. In the meantime, the Mercedes is, I'm with Craig Scarborough, obviously. Craig, it is a very quick car on fast circuits. We've seen that. Whether Mercedes are in denial about how good the Ferrari is on slow circuits is kind of beside the point. But in reality, we know on very slow circuits, the agility of the Ferrari, let's call it the shorter wheelbase Ferrari, definitely works for them. The drivers can do more with it. They can look after their tyres. The time management program is better. When the circuit suits the car, Silverstone, good example, and Lewis Hamilton is in sync with the feel of the car, unbeatable, no question about that. The big question going into the second half of the year, of course, is how many times we can expect that Silverstone nirvana to happen for Mercedes.
Well, I think, as you say, Mercedes have got two aspects they're having to sort of struggle with. First of all is the slower, the medium speed corner handling, which is something we've seen them improve, and they seem to be able to understand and work on it through the weekend. I don't think they can always jump on it, as we saw in Hungary, straight away. It takes a day of setup to work through. Then you've got the temperature of the track, and they like cooler temperatures. The car works its tyres quite hard, and again, Silverstone, perfect storm, fast corner circuit, cool temperatures, ideal for Mercedes. But again, you've seen Mercedes have got on top of their tyre issues as the year has gone on. So I think as we go into the second half of the year, they'll understand the car, understand the tyres much better. And we should see what they describe as the diva style of the car, where it needs to be set up very carefully. They'll be on top of that, and that should improve towards the back end of the year, which should be the operative word.
And as we've said already, and I've said in other videos, of course, there is the other matter of the driver policy at Mercedes. And the moment they want to be very fair, but they also want to control the way the two drivers race, which is kind of an oxymoron. But nonetheless, that is where they're going. And Toto Wolff is saying once a driver, one of his two drivers, has a measurable advantage in the World Championship, then probably the emphasis will go to him. But that may well be the second last race of the year. So who knows where Sebastian Vettel will be by then. Putting that to one side, James Allison leaving for Ferrari and going to Mercedes over the winter. Mercedes firing Paddy Lowe, obviously. It's been okay. We don't know behind the scenes too much of the repercussions there. What I get a feel for is that Aldo Costa is even more important, perhaps, to Mercedes than we ever imagined. And he's doing a really, really good job. And he's a very calm man. I guess pulse rate's probably 38, even when he's under stress. A lovely man and doing a brilliant job overall, probably keeping that team on the straight and narrow.
Absolutely. I think one of the great things we've seen from Mercedes, despite their obvious dominance since 2014, is that when they are hit with problems, how methodically they work through their issues, which I'm explaining, with the wheelbase and with the tyres. Very strong engineering team have all gone to work on understanding this, solving the problems without the histrionics and the fallout, and without lots of. They're very quiet and very undercover about what they're doing on the technical side. Not because there's paranoid about secrecy. It's just we're just getting on with the job. We're doing it. We're not going to talk much about it. You can see the results on the track, and clearly it's working for them in the fourth year of these regulations.
And for you, the Spanish Grand Prix was a major event for them, and what they were doing with the front of the car.
Yeah, well, the Spanish Grand Prix was almost a B-spec car, probably the biggest change we've seen to any car. So they changed the nose, they changed the front camera pods, there were elements of the front wing that changed. But I think one of the most sort of pivotal things was what we call the cape. Now, normally teams have what we call these front turning vanes hanging under the front suspension, which start off the airflow. And Mercedes changed to this device, which they call the cape. It was originally called something much longer.
Man with a cape. I remember the Seinfeld episode. Yeah.
Exactly, but it's much, a very outwardly very simple looking thing. And what this is doing is this is actually just creating a very strong airflow, which then drives more air to the barge boards and then therefore around and slightly under the car as well. A very influential piece of bodywork.
It's been on the car ever since.
So it appeared in Spain, has never come off the car.
And what do other teams think of it, do you think?
It's a different way of creating the same sort of airflow as we see with those front turning vanes. This is probably a bit more powerful, probably almost a blunt version of doing this. And we've not seen any teams come out with a copy of it. We've seen similar things in the past with sort of snowplow assemblies on the nose like this. But it just goes to show that their team, and we'll talk about the complexity of the car, this is unusually simple for Mercedes when you see so much complexity on the rest of the car. So I think it just goes to show that, you know, they don't just have, let's just add lots of slots and holes mentality in their aero team, that they've got some, you know, quite clever little ideas.
The car should be good at, obviously, at Spa, Monza, Malaysia, Japan, Austin. Ferrari will be near them in Austin, I would imagine. Nearer than they'll be in Japan, I would guess.
With the back section of the circuit there.
Yeah. Brazil, they'll be okay. What are they like on bumps, Mercedes, do you think, and curbs in general? And let's talk about the curb issue for Sebastian Vettel in Hungary.
Well, I think overall the car does like to have quite an abrasive surface. It doesn't like smooth tracks, and the suspension seems to work very well for them. And that's all to do with their tyre management. Again, we will see that start to change. The car appears to have very good traction, even though we haven't seen it perform so well at slower speed circuits. And
so what was hurting Vettel then in Hungary on the curbs compared with Mercedes, do you think?
I think this is just really how they choose to set the car up. Mercedes is very soft in roll, very hard in pitch. Ferrari is a bit more balanced all around. So I think it's just the different way that the teams like to set the car up. I don't think it's anything endemic in a problem with the car one way or the other.
And just on that point, and presumably it was a steering arm or something that was bent on the Ferrari, the Mercedes does look pretty, touch wood, rock solid, bulletproof, strong race car, right? Even though you could, it appears to me, I may be wrong, but it appears to me they've had more mechanical issues, if that's the right word, than Ferrari in this first half of the year.
I think the first half of the year they did have a lot more sort of petty issues. They did have some other bits and pieces. They haven't had the engine unreliability that Ferrari have, which is kind of balancing the two out. But overall, it appears to be a very well-engineered car. It's just getting that setup and that balance right, which seems to be the weakest link in this entire package.
And what's the Mercedes approach to the whole shark fin?
Well, we saw initially that the car launched with no shark fin whatsoever, and then they introduced a very short shark fin, and then shark fins with cooling outlets. In Spain, they went for the long shark fin, and as we saw initially in Spain, they were seeing the car oversteer suddenly into corners, go off the track. Still a trait of the car, but the shark fin certainly will help that corner entry stability by creating a balancing force with the air hitting the larger shark fin. And that's, again, has remained on the car throughout the season since the Spanish update.
And that cooling slot they have in the top, is that, why are other teams not doing that? Or,
it's very hard to know why other teams haven't done it.
It's quite a cool idea.
It's a very simple and obvious. It's a very simple and obvious way of putting some extra cooling in. Back in 2009, when the side pod rules changed, lots of people had very high outlets.
But does it have any aero effect, having the air come out there, stroke the shape of the?
I think all it is, it's just create an outlet area here, which means the bodywork down and the side pod could be that little bit smaller. I don't think there's anything clever happening with the air coming out of the cooling. I mean, it's not improving rear wing or downforce or anything. It's just
or hurting it.
Or it's not hurting it, clearly not. But it's just one of those little trade-offs. Each of the teams decides where they want their cooling outlet to be, and Mercedes have found an area up there, and maybe other people will copy it, perhaps only in 2018 rather than this year.
One thing we haven't talked about, and perhaps good point, just looking at the video there, is oil and fuel going into the second half of the year with the sort of circuits we're going to. And we saw in Malaysia last year, it is a bit of an issue. Presumably, in the background, there's ongoing development in those areas as well.
Oil and fuel development absolutely crucial with these power units. Although their teams can develop their engines through the year now, they don't have the token system that restricted them, and which really put the onus on the fuel and oil development. But combustion is the key part that makes more power from these engines. The energy recovery systems are now pretty much maxed out from what you can get from them.
But the FIA have now come up with a slightly stricter ruling on oil consumption, right?
Oil consumption is probably one thing that potentially could hurt Mercedes in the second half of the year. So, beginning of the year, the FIA came out and said you can only burn 5 litres of oil during the race, which while it seems like a lot, it's almost like as much as you would put in a normal engine to last you sort of 10,000 miles. For a race engine, it's not unusual for them to blow a lot of oil out. As we know, or as believed, teams are using some of that oil blown out from the engine to go back in and add additives into the combustion, which means that it's additives that you can't put in the fuel, which means you get better combustion, create more power. And you can use that both during the race, but you can also use it tactically during things like qualifying and for overtaking strategies on the engine maps. And what's happened now is the FIA have introduced a specific oil consumption, whereas before it was 5 litres per race. Now it's 1.2 litres per 100 kilometres, but that's not in 100 kilometres you can only burn 1.2. It's at any point you cannot exceed that flow rate of oil coming out of the engine potentially into the combustion side. And that's going to reduce to 0.9 of a litre and then eventually to 0.6. Which means for qualifying, you can't be. But
when's that going to be reduced over what period of time?
So from Monza onwards, it's 0.9. Any engine introduced after Monza and in 2018 will be 0.6, which is half the oil consumption that they're having at the moment. Which means in qualifying, you can't blow by lots of oil to go back into the combustion, which potentially could give you much more power. And we suspect that that would hamper Mercedes more than Ferrari.
Why?
Which were quite,
Why?
Well, because Mercedes have been running technology like this for quite some time. So the paddock rumour is to be believed. Obviously, Mercedes say that they're completely legal. They're not burning oil, which is completely understandable. Ferrari were chastised by the FIA for having a second oil tank, which had a different mix of oil, which could be used tactically, again, to boost the power of the engine. So it's just the FIA just slowly, finding wording to stamp out some of this stuff, because when you have a regulation that limits you on fuel use, teams shouldn't be using oil as a secondary form of fuel or a secondary form of additives to add power. So I think this is all quite right, and it could hurt Mercedes a little bit.
Well, as I said in the Ferrari video, Binotto's an engine man and he's in charge of the car. You couldn't have a better guy at this point with that coming up.
Absolutely.
Very interesting to see how it works out.